Think of the people you interact with every day. Would you want to spend a day in a canoe with them? Hi, I'm Nathan Mercero, CEO of Planning Alternatives. We're a disruptive brand in the financial planning space with a point of view that true wealth has nothing to do with money. Growing up in a small town in Canada, I experienced examples of families with money and without. It started me on this journey of understanding wealth and the idea that spending a day in a canoe with someone could be one of the best investments you could make. Join me as I sit down with leaders, entrepreneurs, creatives, rule breakers, and friends to discover their perspective of true wealth. And maybe you'll start to shift yours. I'm excited today to be joined by Lindsay Linton Buk. Lindsay is an author, photographer, and visual storyteller based in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the founder of Linton Productions. Lindsay's a fifth-generation Wyomingite. Her work centers on people, place, and the quiet power of listening. She's a creator of Women in Wyoming, a decade-long documentary, portrait, and interview project that has grown into a museum, exhibition, podcast, and the notable book, Women Shaping the West, Stories from Wyoming, published in 2026 this year. Lindsay, we met a few months ago. Great to see you again. Welcome to Day in a Canoe, and love to hear just your story. What has led to the evolution of your book and what's going on in your life? I know those are broad questions, but love for you to.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Nathan. As I was sharing at the top of the call, just love what you're doing to paint a broader picture of wealth. I often say with this body of work that I'm very rich in relationship. That is what this project has given me over and over again. The project I've worked on the last decade has culminated in this book. It's portraits, it's interviews, it's 25 stories, women making an impact in what we call in Wyoming as the cowboy state. That's our unofficial motto. Our official motto is equal rights because Wyoming was the first state to enfranchise women and recognize women's right to hold office. So this project has a lot of inspiration points. Part of it is adding the female voice to the contemporary history of Wyoming and the American West. I think that sometimes gets lost in the iconography of the American West, which is very centered on the cowboy, kind of this nostalgia, black and white imagery, especially from the photographic perspective. So as a photographer, I wanted to add kind of in vivid color the women who are making an impact in this place we call home in Wyoming, in particular, this very wild and rugged landscape. As you know from living here, we're the least populated state in the country and the 10th largest in size. So there's a lot of isolation, but a lot of wildness. And as somebody who grew up in Wyoming, I'm from a small farm town in the northwest part of the state. I never imagined I would have a future in Wyoming as a creative. I really couldn't wait to leave. My journey took me to LA. It took me to New York City. My parents were big skiers, so my brothers and I grew up ski racing. They bought a house in Jackson in the 80s. That's home base now. So I came back to Jackson from New York City and eventually kind of had to decide, why couldn't I make a life here? As you know, living in Jackson, it's quite a dynamic community. There are a lot of opportunities here. It is a very creative, artistic place. And so this project, is born out of so many things. It's from, that little girl growing up in Powell, looking across these expansive spaces, just questioning what could be possible here, ultimately leaving, coming home, and then through the lens of my peers, connecting with other women, trying to answer those questions. And the women I feature in the book have very diverse backgrounds. I have a backcountry pilot to our first female Supreme Court justice, to an abstract expressionist painter, to business women, and all walks of life. And was just really trying to answer that question of what can be forged across these stark, isolated landscapes. I was trying to answer that for myself while also trying to tell this broader picture of the impact that women have always created in our world, but haven't always been recognized for.
I found that life itself is a story. So it's interesting as you get perspective of your own life, you now see different expressions of that through the people you meet or who you profiled in this book. In thinking about our conversation, I was reflecting on a book that I read last summer by Zane Grey simply called Wyoming. And it was through the eyes of, I think the character was Martha Dixon, and she traveled across the country to come to Wyoming, and it was all her perspective. What is unique about a woman's perspective in a Wyoming experience that you've personally discovered or highlighted in your book?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I never, because it's so small scale, especially where I grew up in Powell, it's a farm town. There's a community college there, but it's generally a place in a community where people are just working hard and you need to just step up however you can. I also think that the sport that I did as a ski racer, that was in Red Lodge, Montana, but very close by. Montana's similar to Wyoming in terms of being rural and expansive and wild. We were training with the boys. We would race against the girls, but it wasn't really segregated in our training. So I feel like, and then I have two younger brothers too. So I feel like so much of my experience growing up in Wyoming was just a lot of freedom, from just having really big, expansive places to roam to, yeah, just the small nature of the community and this aspect of you just need people to be involved and engaged. And because it's so small scale, you just have to step forward. I think if you look at the history of like the territorial period of our state, I tell 20 historical stories in the book, and there's so many more that could be told. Because of that legislation where, we got our name equal rights. We gave the country first female governor, first female justice of the peace. But then, there were women in small towns who were the librarian and the mayor of their town, or the game warden and a county commissioner while also running their ranch and raising 7 kids. So I think it's just, that's kind of a spirit I still see today with a lot of women I featured. It's just you step forward, because in a lot of cases you have to, because your community needs you, but also because there is space for your voice to be heard. Of course, as I've gotten older, it's not all like roses and just that picture of equal rights is really varies depending on who you're speaking to. And I also serve on our Wyoming Women's Foundation board, which is a statewide organization that works for economic self-sufficiency for women and girls across the state. We do a lot of advocacy in the legislature. We're a grant making organization. But that's been a really fun organization to engage with because we work more within the structures. Like, what are the laws? What are the structural barriers? The project is more aspirational and showing just that individual agency and power. But of course, whether it's Wyoming or just in our world, there are still those structural kind of barriers that exist that we need to work through legislation and other ways to create just more support for not just women, but I think parents and all people. So, yeah, I think there's always a tension there, but certainly growing up in such a wild place, I think just that sense of freedom, like we just had, you're just in the wild all the time. And now being a mom and raising 2 boys, like that's the most important thing for me to impart to them is just that sense of connection, I think, to nature and these grounding places so that we want to protect them, but also because I do think they nurture a sense in us that there's something bigger than us out there but that we're a part of it at the same time.
How did you decide to put this project together? And do I understand
Yeah.
it took a little while?
Yes, yes. When I look back at it now, I'm like, "It's so insane." To me because, yeah, I had moved back from New York. I was working for a headshot photographer in New York City who he ran the busiest headshot studio in New York. We would photograph 3 people a day, 4 days a week. I became his studio manager and associate photographer. When I moved back to Wyoming, I was super burnt out on photographing headshots. We worked with a lot of actors and, people kind of playing parts. And I think part of growing up in Wyoming too, you're just very connected to what's real. And so I wasn't so interested in more of that superficial kind of aspect of that body of work. But when I moved home to Jackson, it's like, well, I have this skill to shoot contemporary headshots and no one's exactly doing that here. So I opened my business and it was doing well. After about, a period of time, just having a little more space, I started to think a little more creatively and expansively again. And I did feel very disconnected from the rest of the state. Jackson is a bubble. It is not exactly reflective of how most people live. And we're also, we are on the very western edge of our state. So, like, we're physically kind of isolated in this valley. But then, we just kind of live, I think, disconnected from the state in a lot of ways. And I still felt like there was more in me to create. And so this idea to connect with my peers really came to life. At the same time, I still kind of held this long-term belief Like, I can't really express myself fully creatively here. And so this project really became a way for me to confront that belief system. It was always a big vision as an artist. I do kind of, I see kind of the end result, whether I'm working with you to tell your branding story through images or like with this project. Like I could see it as this large body of work in a book form, in the exhibit form, through the storytelling, through the portraits, through the writing. And it was very overwhelming. So it's figuring out how to begin, how to start, how to keep moving forward. I thought I could tell 5 stories in a year because I was still operating my business and that was a priority. And that's where I began. I just started talking to people, asking for recommendations. I partnered with a nonprofit, Momentum. They're a local nonprofit in Jackson that does a lot with women's leadership. With that partnership, I could fundraise and apply for grants. And because I knew I would need a lot of financial resources to not just travel, but I was shooting medium format film, which is very expensive, not only to buy the rolls, you get 12 shots a roll, but then to send off to be developed. For the exhibit, we rescanned those selects and then printed really large scale. So there were a lot of, financial costs with this production. I thought I could tell 5 and figure out the funding, figure out how to create a podcast because I had never done that before. And just, even shooting film, I had never done that for a body of work this large. So it was taking a lot of risks and it was really kind of going bigger than I ever had for a storytelling project. And 5 seemed like a really manageable way to begin. And then once I told those first 5, I built a website, a platform for the project, just launched everything at once. And then we were off to the races. Then it was, I got my first exhibit, which was 2 years later. So then I had a deadline to meet. And so then I really had to, I got to 22 stories by the time the exhibit opened. I was 34 weeks pregnant with my first son. I became a mom. I had my second son in 2021. I finished the final 3 stories after he was born because I wanted, it's 5 chapters, 5 stories a chapter, 25 stories. So that was the end goal. And then the book was just something that had to wait. I was in the weeds for a lot of years with having my boys back to back and just needed to be a little more quiet and focus on touring the exhibit. And, thank goodness I did because creating a book is definitely, it's a beast and it does demand a lot of your energy and your headspace. And I just didn't have that for many years. So yeah, the book just released last 2 months ago in March. And the very first story I told was in December 2016. So it's been this like decade culmination from when I started to getting to the book point.
Congratulations. That's a journey. What advice would you give women or any creatives who are working on a project, but they're getting bamboozled by this thing called life and competing obligations, family and job and priorities, and there's health and wellness. How do you navigate that space? What would have been some learnings or observations that you've had?
Yeah, I think you really have to be honest and surrender to the moment of life that you're in. And sometimes you're going to have a moment of life where you can charge and you can be incredibly productive. That was, most of the production for the project happened in this window between the end of 2016 and 2019 when my exhibit opened. And I describe it in the book that my drive was like a runaway train that couldn't be stopped. It was just like funding, okay, that's just a problem to be solved. Building exhibit, just a problem to be solved. Like I was so determined and I just made it happen. But I had the agency, I had more time to build those resources and support. When I became a mom, especially those early years, it was incredibly challenging for me because I always have been a pretty high functioning person where it's like, oh, if I just have the vision, like I just go do it. And it was like, oh, I literally could not hold all the balls that I was trying to juggle and carry. And it's like, okay, this moment does require me to surrender a bit. I do need to do less right now. That's more of a identity, I think, shift where when you've gone from being someone that can manage a lot to saying like, oh, I actually need to do less right now. For me, that was more of just an identity crisis, honestly. But it was okay, and I feel like I had so many, there's so many moms in my book, so many moms who are mentors where they were like, it's okay, it's gonna come back. Like, just try to keep a foot in the door and just, it was surrendering to a moment where I needed to just do less. But it was still a space of dreaming, and I think dreaming can be an active space. You can still be dreaming and be observing of the life you wanna build, and sometimes that's all you can do when you're in that survival phase. And I think understanding, and I learned this with my speaking to the women in my project too, that everything in life is a moment. It constantly is changing. So whatever moment of life you're in, it's going to change. With the book, it was something I had to let go of. I actually tried to produce it after I had my second son. I was talking to an agent and pitching, and it was like banging my head against a wall. It was just not working. And it's like, I guess I tried, and like I have to be happy with what I have produced. Like I've created this exhibit. The exhibit has toured I think 8 venues in 6 years. I've created this documentation. I've created the photo record, the audio record. Like that's enough. And I really did let it go. And it was I think 2 or 3 years later where I just had, more of a sense of myself. My boys were a little older. They're still quite young. They're 6.5 and almost 5. So still very dependent, but I'm not so in the weeds of those early years. And the book kind of came back around. I was like, okay, now it's time. So I think you really just have to be honest with what's going on in your life right now and be willing to surrender to that moment. And that might require you to get uncomfortable and release identities that no longer serve you. And I think if you do have the energy where you have a little more time or resources to seize that moment as well and see where it can go. And, this body of work has taken on its own life and been something that I've just been really devoted to for almost a decade now, and or for over a decade really. And I don't know, I think I've just had a lot of trust in it, but it's kind of taken on its own life too, and I've just tried to keep up with it at points. I think there's always something you can do with the time, money, and resources you have available right now, and there's also moments where you just maybe have to dream and take a step back. But for me, yeah, this project has always just been surrendering to the moment of life, and that is the creative process and the creative spirit, and that's kind of what I wanna show with these stories is there's so many paths you can take. It's just about being honest with who you are, and we need people to be in their self and in their authenticity. Like, those are the gifts we need to the world, and that's what these women represent.
Listening to you share what comes up is a phrase that a friend of mine introduced me to: let's do less better. And many times we get caught up in the scattergraph of a lot of competing agendas. But if we focus simplifying and quality of engagement instead of quantity, things appear. And then your discussion, or I think you mentioned the word surrender at least half a dozen times. And I've found that's is such a profound principle because when we surrender, then we become present. And many times we chase the next thing or plan ahead, or we live in the past with rumination or regret or whatever there's might be there, but the present is where we're fully alive. So your openness to share to that end, and it sounds like you're navigating your definition of true wealth quite nicely too.
I am. I'm in another kind of pivot because, I've had a service-based business for years, and since becoming a mom, I've found that that creates a bit of a ceiling for me and a bit of a barrier where, I just I s even though my boys are a little older, it's like showing up for that volume, it's not possible right now, and it's not what I want either. So, it is trying to create, wealth and opportunity now in ways that are different business models. The book is kind of the first foray into that. Like now, like it was so much to get to that point of creating a product, but now I have this product that can sell forever. And it is that, and it's so much more than that. But yeah, I mean, this whole phase or this whole year to me is a bit of a pivot year where it's trying to unlock the next phase of being a creator and a mom, and what works for that equation, because it is very dynamic, I think you have kids as well, like, you have so many different phases, and, like, just when that's what I think the surrender aspect, which I spoke to, still working on it, but that is what becoming a parent, like, you can only get so far ahead. They do keep you out in the present, like, especially young kids. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of in this next leap where I wanna be financially, but also kind of maintain those other aspects of life that are so important, being present for my family as a mom, still trying to push myself creatively as an artist, creating more books. Definitely after creating this book, I'm like, "Oh, I wanna do more." Like, there's just something about when you have the physical object, like, even though this work has been out there for so long, it's a different level, it's a different scale, and it's just a different I don't know, there's something about creating the physical record that's quite profound, and I definitely want it. Like, so now I'm like, "Okay, how do I make creating books and kind of these archives that have different aspects of the creative process, how can I continue to build upon that?" Yeah, bring, something that doesn't take 10 years for the next one as well. Because now that we've done it, we can do it in at least half the time for the next round, hopefully. I'm definitely in a big shift right now, but it's exciting, and I think, yeah, it's just asking yourself all those questions, like, what do you want? It's entering midlife. I turned 40 last year. I feel like that's just a big jump too, where you're like, I don't know, things it just has felt like a very big shift entering my 40s in an exciting way. But yeah, it's exciting.
Well, we're always evolving, and
Mhm.
that's the gift life gives us. I want to thank you, Lindsay, for taking the time to share your story and perspective, and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. Appreciate our conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review. To discover what wealth means to you, please take our assessment at planningalt.com.